So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to tune in to this recording. I'm Nina Kong-Surtees. For those who are not familiar, I'm the founder and chief art advisor for Smart Advisory and the hostess of Sundays at the Studio. I found this company with a mission to empower and elevate the role of artists through entrepreneurship and create unique opportunities in partnership with art collectors and businesses. And coming from a family of artists myself and being in the art world over 15 years, I can really relate to the challenges of being an artist. And despite the stigma and myth of the starving artists, I always admired the career path of artists because of their courage and visions and helping us to see the world and reality differently and transporting us to new places and enable us to shift our perspective through their imaginations. This is why I created Sundays at Studio to give a voice and visibility behind the work and feature artists who have achieved their success in the art world. So this is perfect transition to introduce Libby, an artist who demonstrated the power of art through transformation and healing in her personal and professional life. Aside from being a self-taught artist, Kristina is a writer, an innovator, and a professor of digital marketing and a technology executive. So her current work, Floral art piece, I just want to quote, acts as a blessing, as a safe place, as a hope, and hopefully provides a moment of distraction and remembrance of this strange moment, end quote. So Kristina, thank you so much for taking your time to speak to everyone about your journey as an artist. And it is such an honor and pleasure to have you as my guest. And when I was preparing for the interview, I was really inspired by your story, how you were able to transform yourself personally and professionally after a traumatic event. And it's just the way you dealt with, your injury and be able to overcome those obstacles and being able to take that and create more healing space for everyone, especially during difficult time like today.
Thank you. Yeah, thank
Um,
you so much.
yeah, so could you tell us a little bit more about yourself as an artist and how that all began and what made you start your career as an artist?
Yeah, so I sort of this iteration of my life, I guess, is a direct response to something that happened about a year and a half ago. So in August of 2019, I was kite surfing, which was my then most, or I guess the end of July 2019. It's this kite surfing has sort of become a huge part of my life. I would travel. I really felt very connected to nature doing this sport. And then I was kite surfing one day in Brooklyn, and I was trying to fly a really, really large kite. And I lifted the kite up, and it was just too big for me. I didn't know how to handle it, and I got pulled up and then realized I was very quickly going towards the highway. So the Belt Parkway was about, I don't know, 200 meters away from where I was. So I went over the beach, over the soft sand dunes. And then when I realized I was very close to sort of flying into traffic, I released the harness or the clip on the harness on my kite. And I fell from about 12 feet and I landed on my head. And I had a pretty extreme brain injury that meant that I couldn't really handle any light or sound. Physical touch made me actually just break down crying because the sensory experience of it was so overwhelming. And my brain was really just you need to do something, you need to paint. The weird thing about having that kind of an injury, the way it manifested in me was that I had very little impulse control. So I just went to the store and I bought hundreds of dollars of paint and canvas and oil paints. I only wanted to use oil paints for whatever reason. That was the only medium that seemed interesting. And then I went and I just set up a canvas and I just tried to paint something, anything. I had no idea what to do. I didn't even have any kind of mediums. I had nothing to blend the oil paints with. So I was just using thick paint. I just really had no idea what I was doing. And but it stopped the headaches. And that was a really pivotal moment, to realize that my brain knew exactly what it needed in order to have a cessation of pain. And so I started painting every day for maybe 4 to 6 hours a day. So I would work a little bit, paint for a couple of hours, work a little bit, paint for a couple of hours, and then try to paint for like 2 or 3 hours before I went to bed at night. This was the only way I could fall asleep, because it was the only way that sort of the pain was reduced enough. Um, and that really started this whole new kind of like re-entry into art for me. I think I was one of those people who was sort of told the starving artist myth, and so I didn't want to be poor because I grew up poor, and I didn't want that to be my life. I didn't want to have that fear of, not having enough of whatever it was that I needed to do whatever it was that I wanted. And so I made art for the first time, because sort of all of those fears were so essentially like that was what had held me back for a long time. And then my brain injury was just like, sorry, like all of those myths that you have been taught to believe, like they don't matter. Like what matters is that you paint things. And so I ended up sort of painting things sort of like what you see behind me, a lot of like big color fields of, this actually isn't a very good example, mostly like large canvases, that are just like huge swaths of color, but sort of like slightly abstracted landscapes, or really simplified landscapes of big color fields. Because I think my brain found that really calming. So that's kind of how I entered this journey, that I've I think really been on in the past few years. And then I was painting for months and months and months. And then my mom is so wonderful. She's such a mom. She was like, why don't you share those paintings with anyone who's not me? And so I started sharing them on my personal Instagram feed. And then people were like, oh, I like that. Like, I would buy that. What are you doing with that? And then I was like, oh, maybe if I keep practicing this for a long time, like maybe there's something in that. And then it's sort of changed and grown from there.
I love your story. It's such an inspiring story, and I think you hit a lot of good points in your story. I mean, first of all, like, oh my God, like art, like you really tap into the one of the key aspect of being like art, like what art can do, like
Yeah.
healing and not just transforming the viewer or the artist, but also you were able to heal through the whole process.
Yeah, I think that's like a really under discussed, or it's certainly in a lot of the circles I'm part of,
Mm,
is the under discussed aspect that just creating can have on a person, right? I think
yeah.
um I was reading something that was was actually like a bit of a religious text, but it was talking about creativity as divine expression. And the example they were using is sort of in biblical text, Torah, the Bible. Um, it starts with this idea that like God created something, and whether or not you believe in God, or I think there is this sort of innate part of their argument was that God created, and as humans built in the image of God, and as humans need or desire or sort of compulsion to create. And I do think that part of the story is very, very true, right? Like, regardless of sort of the religious connotation in which that
Right.
comes out of, one of the things that makes humans human is this need to create and to make things and to manifest things. And I think many, many people are engaged in jobs that don't actually allow for a lot of creative practice or creative thinking. And I think we sort of like stumble along in our lives without doing that. But if you are a person who like really does require kind of an extreme amount of creative expression or creative time, and you don't allow that to yourself, I think it actually becomes sort of like a sickness in your body. And I will say that, I mean, the reason I got into that kite surfing accident wasn't bad, right? Like it came, the whole reason that happened is because I was just like moving too quickly. I wasn't paying attention enough. I was like trying to do something that I wasn't yet capable of doing. And I had this accident. And in having that accident, it like forced me to slow down, to like reimagine my life, to like re-understand who I was, and to become very, very clear on the fact that like creativity and being a creative person is at is at my core and is necessary for my personal happiness. And I think that's true for almost everyone, but I don't think we give ourselves permission to be artists because we're afraid of the connotations around it. We're afraid what it means for our lives. And like actually in truth, I think everyone is an artist. We just don't listen to ourselves very often. And then most people don't want to put in the work either, right? Like you have to put in so much work before you create anything you're happy with at all.
Absolutely. I think this is one of the things like that. I think that sparked my interest also. With my mission, I think, yes, it's been undervalued, right? The creativity has been being underestimated, undervalued in our society because of that stigma, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, you can't make money out of creativity. Well, yes, in fact, creativity is nothing if no work is done, right? Like as long as you put in the work, and the creativity would flourish. And that's, I mean, I was just also been working on my new blog on terms of creativity, right? Aspect of creativity, how that can generate, that led to a lot of innovation technology that we don't even look at. I mean, I love to hear your perspective as a technology executive. I think that's something that a lot of people don't tap into. Like you mentioned, it's just that when you think of innovation, you don't think about creativity or the art behind that necessarily.
Or like you only think of innovation within really like a very specific confine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of, this is technology innovation. This is innovation with the cloud. This is innovation in artificial intelligence. This is, we kind of look up these very specific sectors of where technology innovation comes from. But I actually think when you sort of take a step back further and you look at American society and you look at sort of spaces where we are right now, right? Which is like we're in America that is like largely fractured, where there is like a lot of dissent. There's a ton of unhappiness. There's a lot of like pointing at each other, like, this is wrong. You shouldn't do this. There is very little vision for the future of what we want America to look like and to be, and to give people sort of purpose in achieving those goals. And that the reason we don't have vision is a creative exercise, right? And so innovation is in response to vision, which is like that big vision is like uber creative, right? Like it is asking someone to say what would you really like this world to be? And not in a trite way, not like more loving or less political division. It's like, what would you like to see in this world? If we gave you a big blank canvas, what does this world look like? And how do you get people excited about that? And then underneath that that big vision are sort of these pillars where we can start to activate technological innovations, right? But technology innovations are still such a small part of that pathway to achieving a really big vision.
Right.
And so a lot of those other pillars are things like education reform, or they're things like I'm personally really interested or curious about sort of spiritual reform in America. So like what does actually like what is the role that religion and spirituality is playing in America? And like, why don't we talk about it? And like, what does that look like? How does that change? Like, that is a core part of the conversation. All the conversations about racial inequality, economic inequality, like, all of those are pillars that would support some sort of big vision. And in each of these areas, we need so much innovation and we need so much creativity. And I think we do a lot to default to this idea of like, technological innovation as sort of the creative innovation of the moment. And the weirdest thing about that is like we are letting technology set the agenda for what we want the future of the world to be, rather than setting a vision for what we want the world to be and asking technologists to help us support that vision, which is honestly where most technologists are much better qualified um, to play. And also, when we ask a rather ubiquitous looking group of people to set a forward agenda for us, we are going to get an agenda that only suits a very specific looking core group of people. And so I think one of the problems that we have, even when we look at sort of artists or we look at other broad creatives, is they have been so put into a specific section of society, and that harms everyone else. Like why don't we have a senator who's also an artist? Or why, where are these people who are able to think in much more abstractive ways, who can sort of help to set a much more national or social vision? I think that's where we have a lot of problems.
No, I think, again, like, I think you really express those ideas really well. I think one key aspect of especially in the United States, the education system, the first thing that gets cut off is the arts, of everything else, whether it's, even in an economic crisis that we're dealing with, everything gets, like, the first thing that is being cut off is the art. And art institutions are struggling, and as well as the education and our future, right? Like, because if no one can educate our children, like, who's gonna continue that?
Right. And yet a challenge on that is also like, I don't know that art institutions, we talked about healing earlier, right? And we think we have this idea that like a painting on a wall in a museum can have like a healing effect on someone. I do think that is true, right? Like I do think you can have an experience with a painting or a sculpture or something that does give you a sense of healing. I do think that as an artist, you can make something that gives you a sense of healing. But I think it is also on the artistic community to take a bigger step out of art and to make a bigger agenda and to take on a bigger mantle in society, and showing what that sort of creative thinking and that differentiated thinking can do. I think, I recall, I don't know if you remember sort of the protest moment that there was about the Sacklers, where all of the prescription scripts fluttered down in New York City. And this is one of the things about my brain injury, is I have a hard time sort of recalling things from before the injury. But a moment like that, right, where it's like artists were making a very extreme and very specific stand against what was happening in society. And I think that kind of work forces other people to look at artists and their points of view and their conversations and their vision. And I honestly, as someone who has worked in technology, I've worked in international security, I've worked in like a bunch of different sort of non-artistic professions, conversation from the arts like doesn't get over there, right? Like it just doesn't. And so the challenge is like a bit on the artist to be like, no, you have to pay attention to what I'm saying. I have good ideas and I can help you frame your ideas. And then it's also part on these industries to be like, our siloed ways of thinking about these solutions aren't working. We need to go to other people rather than go to consultants who sort of give the same ideas all the time. Why don't we bring in other leaders and conversational thinkers into the dialogue? And I think that's part of the problem, right? Is we're doing a lot to sort of be like, oh, well, arts get cut off first. But the reason arts get cut off first is because most people think about arts as things that are consumed rather than things that create change.
Or, art is not been taken seriously. I think it's just like, people consider it as like a form of entertainment, right? It's like,
Right,
oh,
exactly.
it's like a hobby. Someone does it as a hobby, or it's like a children's activity. And people don't understand the real power behind art or the purpose of art, right? There have been scientific studies where art can actually heal, and there are some like programs out there that are helping certain patients, maybe definitely for brain injury patients. There are scientific evidence, proof that has been that has been occurred. And I think it also, again, I think that's definitely should be a collaboration with artists, because the artists have great visions, that most are, because I think a lot of people, people think that it's like a separate thing, right? Like, oh, the creativity is only belong to the role of artists. They're the one who's like, but at the end of the day, as a species, as a human species, we are given the creativity that sets us apart from the rest of the species in the animal kingdom, right? And it's been underutilized. It's so true, because the compartmentalization of our society, right? Like, oh, artists like should be doing only visual things, and the technologists should be only focused on the technology aspect of things. But they need to
right. And I think like a role that artists can really help play is like helping other people to think more creatively. Like I spoke at Capitol Hill a couple of years ago about deepfake technology. And, I was doing this briefing for all of these congressional aides, and I like explained what deepfake technology was. I talked about why it was important. I like talked about how it could be misused. And the question people had like afterwards was just like, well, what does that really mean for the world? And I was just like, but I told you all of these things, just like use your imagination. Like here are all the ways that like, video edited with malintent could be used negatively. And people were just like what? Right. And I remember being so shocked at just the way that wasn't natural for other people to take a concept, apply their imagination to it, and then like ultimately conceive of worst case scenario, which is like what the only way my mind works, right? Which is just like, oh, this could be really bad. Here are 7,000 ways it could be really awful. And then sitting here being like, well, don't you guys see it? Why can't you see it? Why isn't anyone doing anything about it? Right. And so I think helping people to engage with their imagination and then learn how to express those ideas in different ways. It's almost something that maybe we like need to relearn as adults or re-understand. Or I mean, I also think the challenge to artists is like, how can you do more with the art that you create, right? Yeah. Like, how do you take it outside of institutions? How do you take it outside of homes? Like, how do you make it so that people have to be forced to respond to whatever it is you're making, which is ultimately sort of where I got to last spring when I started the Floral Heart Project, is because I like just had a message. And if I'm a writer, so normally when I have really pointed things I want to say, I write them in places. And it was too early for people to engage with my idea, but it wasn't too early for the idea to be important. And so I really was like, I'm going to start this like public art project, because that is a way in for people who maybe don't want to read, or when I can't get the ideas published or something like that, right? And so I think, I'm not saying everyone should be making public art all the time, but I'm saying like, when you do have the idea and you have the thing you want to say, deciding to step out of the comfort of the studio or deciding to step out of the comfort of your practice and say that and keep saying it until people start paying attention is incredibly important.
Yeah, I was just gonna get to that point, because like you actually literally took your work outside of a canvas and literally took it out there physically, right? As yourself, it's like almost like a performative aspect, right? You're literally putting yourself out there and to convey the message that's more impactful and trying to heal our time, what we're going through. So can you elaborate on that project?
Yeah, so I started the Floral Heart Project in April of last year as a COVID memorial project. And it started because, so I have a master's degree in international security. I have studied mass trauma for a really long time. I still work in national security. I work in technology. And I knew inherently, and then also from the research that I started to look at, that like, if we didn't have ways for people to grieve publicly, we were sort of in for a world of hurt, right? Particularly in instances where we have delayed or deferred grieving, that leads to moderate to severe levels of PTSD. When you look at a corollary like Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Sandy, what you're looking at is 10 to 15% of the population suffering from PTSD because they didn't feel like they had the ability to grieve. If you look at those numbers across America, that is 50 million people who could suffer from moderate to severe PTSD. That's substance abuse, that's physical violence, anxiety, depression, will overwhelm our mental health industry. And so I was just like, this doesn't, like, this is really, really bad. And normally in situations of mass trauma, you have space to grieve. You have walls, you have flowers you can put down, there are photos, you feel the response of the whole community. In this case, in large part because we were still in the middle of the trauma, there wasn't anything being done and we couldn't leave our homes. Um, but I knew it wasn't like a 6 month done thing, right? It was like, this is going to impact us for over a year. We need to do something now because otherwise there's going to be so much violence and so much just sort of soul work, right? Like that kind of work of just being like, no one cares for me. I don't feel loved. I don't feel these deaths didn't matter. And so I created this project called the Floral Heart Project. And I did, I chose flowers because they're such a natural gift at a funeral. And even though it's really twee, I chose a heart because it really said what I wanted to say, which is, I'm sorry that you're grieving. I see you. I care, right? Like that's what I wanted to say. I just wanted people to know that someone cared. And so I they made these garlands. They took me a long time. I didn't know how to do them. I watched a bunch of YouTube videos and tried to figure it out. And then I went and I placed one in Brooklyn Bridge Park in Brooklyn and here in New York. And I just went and set it down and I did it with an extreme amount of fear. I wore a mask and hat and gloves. And I was like, is this illegal? I have no idea. Can you do this? I don't know. I'm just going to do it anyway. And I went and did it. And then I just left. I think I took a picture. I didn't even take a picture. I think I left, took my hat off, changed my mask, and then came back and took a photo, and shared it with a few friends, and they found it really meaningful. And I was just felt so compelled to do it again and again. I felt like someone with OCD. I was just had to keep compulsively making these hearts. And but I did it a bit for this public dialogue conversation because I was just felt like people were ignoring the people that we had lost. And especially because a lot of, I lived in a sort of wealthy neighborhood. I lived in a neighborhood where a lot of people had a second home. A lot of people left the country, left the community. And I just felt like so many people were just oh, this is such an annoyance on my life, blah, 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 blah. And people weren't paying attention to the fact that more people were dying than any recent war that we had in America. And I was just so sad, but also kind of angry. And also just you don't get to do that. You don't get to pretend that these people's lives don't matter because that's not fair. And so I just kept doing it and doing it. And then I reached out to 1-800-Flowers because the idea was impoverishing me because it was very expensive to get enough flowers to sort of make a meaningful sized heart. And they were amazing. So then they came on 1-800-Flowers and they essentially sponsored the creation of a bunch of these hearts, and they have paid for the flowers. And they have helped coordinate the permits. And so then this project has really been able to grow so much more extensively because of this corporate backing. Because there was definitely a point where I was just how much of my personal money do I need to spend to force other people to recognize sort of all of the losses that we were experiencing? And I continue to be really fascinated by the way that sometimes you have to change your medium in order to ensure that your message goes through, right? And so I paint. I love my paintings. I am a very slow painter. There's no way that I'm painting anything on the street that is capable of this message. But these floral hearts were capable of delivering the message in a different way. And then recently, I wanted to do something that was much more permanent. So these hearts kind of they're out for 3 days, they're out there for a week, and then they die and they disappear and I have to remove them, right? And so I wanted to make a new project, something that was much more permanent, but that also showed the enormity of the loss that we had experienced. And so I created a digital projection piece where there is a rose petal that drops for every single life that we have lost, and every 2 seconds of this projection correspond to one day since the start of 2020. And so you watch this piece and you realize like it started with one death, right? And I think we forget about that. Like there was that first one person, and then there were just a few people, and it wasn't a big idea. And then there are waves, right? And it gets to a point where the petals actually end up looking like like blood under a microscope, because they're all these petals sort of pushed together in the creation of this piece. And that was sort of like a new way for people who, were like, oh, these flower hearts are, that's a nice floral piece of work, rather than thinking about it as sort of art or sort of a broad scale art piece. They were now able to see this projection and think of it as sort of a more elevated way of having the conversation, and but also is in their face because it's projected in a gallery in Tribeca that's like where it's like a 15-foot tall piece, right? So you sort of like have to reckon with it from across the street. And I find that very interesting, right? Like how sometimes you have something you really want to say and you just have to find a bunch of different ways to say it. It's a thing I teach in digital marketing, which is like if your product isn't selling, it's you're doing the bad job, right? Like the customer, it's not like a customer is doing something awful. You haven't convinced people why they should.
Right. It's the messaging. You're not conveying that message
Yeah.
the proper way. I mean, there
Yeah.
are many ways conveying one single idea, but if you don't
Absolutely.
execute that correctly, obviously, then it's not work. Something's not working.
Right. And
And
with repetition, I think
absolutely,
so much of it is
repetition.
just over. I mean, people didn't really care about the hearts until I had done a dozen of them. And then people are like, oh, well, like what's happening over here? And now that I've done 40 and we'll have done
Wow.
50 by the end of the next week, people are like, oh, wait, this is a thing, right? And it's just, I'm just like, I've been here since April.
Yeah, Abby, I definitely repetition is certainly the key to anything, right? Especially if you want to master something, it's
Yeah.
constant repetition, even though it's redundant and mundane, but that's how you achieve mastery.
Yeah.
And also and attention, right? Because like the more we see things and it triggers our curiosity. It's like, oh, what's going on over here?
Yeah.
And like I mean, again, I'm so inspired by the project itself and how you started it. And it's just that you're actually creating an impact and bringing something that's needed for everyone we're all in this together. It's not like, oh, well, it's not just our country, but it's a whole global thing. And what you're doing is like not just expanding the idea or messaging, but you're actually not only expanding your creativity, but also like bringing people together and memorialize.
Well, and I think that point really sort of goes back to what we talked about like art's healing power, right? So these floral heart pieces, whether you think of them as art or not, they create sacred spaces for people. Like when you come across it in the street, I have seen people kneel down and pray at them. I have seen people bend down and kiss them. I have seen people stop and take 2 or 3 moments and just weep. I have seen them become spaces to hold vigils where people have shared stories, where they have gathered. And I have had people tell me, this is the first time I feel heard. This is the first time I feel like anyone cared about my mom. This is the first time I felt like there was a place for conversation. And that is like kind of what I mean about like taking it out of the museum, or like, museums doing more to create themselves as healing spaces for a community. Because I do think there is this strange thing in the art world about, if your work is considered spiritual, it's not considered art. And if you're, like using a lot of like religious or sort of spiritual terminology, I think um, is I think it's changed a little bit in the art world in the past decade, but still it's like largely no, it's not how you want to be describing your own work. And so that is a weird thing. And yet if we think about one of the reasons that art's being so important is because they're healing people, and healing it from an art perspective is like largely sort of a spiritual kind of like sacred experience. It's not like a medical scientific experience, even though there is science research that shows the benefit of it. That research is like the facts, but right, like the research is the proof of something that you are experiencing. And so it's like, if that is the work of art to sort of like better heal the world, then I think we need to figure out how to change the way that people encounter art, or change the kind of experiences that it can have, or even change the messages that it can deliver to people, because that is when it really shows its power, right? Like to me, this whole experience was like, first to help myself feel better, right? Like I made this to sort of feel better, and for me it felt better to give something to people, and then it has like helped people to heal. But it is not something that you would find in an art museum, right? Like it's like that's and so we have this struggle between what is like art, and then what can help people heal, which is everything. It's not just my thing, but like,
Right.
but I think that tension is really incredibly interesting.
I think that one of the challenges in the art is that it's so subjective, right? There's no, it can't be, it really cannot be quantified as in science, right? So science, like you do a bunch of experiments and you are able to quantify the results. Same thing with the other industry, right? Like if you're in sales, like you could quantify like how much sale you're making, numerical values. But in the arts, it's more, it's more conceptual, right? It's more conceptual value that a lot of people have trouble understanding. They don't understand the impact that could have, whether emotionally or mentally. That's sort of, I think that's one of the challenges that we need to overcome, is that,
Yeah.
trying to not necessarily quantify, but able to create an impact that's more meaningful. There are a lot of art out there, but, everyone is different, right, in terms of how they're conveying the message. But
And what you need at what times, right? Like, I mean, I think it's almost like product market fit, which is like the term that I would work on with my students, right? Which is like, the art that I am making right now for people who have lost people for COVID is for them, right? Like, it's not even really about me at all. It is like my gift to them. And that is like really different than the things I paint, which are sort of like my gift to me. And if other people like them and want to buy them, then like they become my gift for them. But like that's really different. And so it's like makes sense that the hearts, like the people who had lost people, appreciated the hearts because they were a gift for them, right? And so I think part of that is this question of like, who are you making art for and why, and like, what do you want that art to do, and why. And I think it became for me, I think the only thing about the hearts for me is that I just like, I didn't want to keep losing money making them, right? Like I didn't want my work to help someone else to come also at like a long-term harm to me. And I think, that has been an interesting journey as well, to navigate how do you do something that you're doing to help the world while also being like, I don't need to make money off of it, but I certainly don't want to be like losing gobs of money in this project.
absolutely, I think that's one of the key challenges that artists have, is that guilt of earning something in order to make more, in order to create impact. And I think that's been misled all these times. This notion of starving artists really stems from the 19th century, right? We have like the image of Van Gogh, right? He literally like starved to that. He was a non-known artist, but he gained to fame when he passed away. But the idea is just ingrained in our society, and the artists today also having challenges, even selling their work, the gift, right? The gift you were sharing with the world. In order to do that, I mean, come on, we all are human beings. We need to sustain ourselves in order to continue making the gift, but we're kind of taught not to, because in some sense it's so greedy to earn money making out of your work, or just making money for art. So
Yeah.
that's just been a taboo that a lot of artists are having challenges with. And just going back to your commentary on gift, giving gift, I mean, you literally found your gift, right? Through art, but you're actually giving back.
Yeah.
It's not just about healing. Well, you've had to heal yourself first in order to heal others. So you've done that through your paintings. And by the way, they're really beautiful work. And even though I'm sure they're amazing in person, but just the way it showed up on screen, I don't know, somehow it just struck me because it was the color and the emotion it triggered. But yeah, you said it was a healing for yourself, but it's also healing for the viewer. But the public art project is more physical, right? Like it's more physical, you're more interacting with people, and you're like, one simple message can generate so many other emotion, as you discovered. And
Yeah.
you're giving people the platform to do it.
And I mean, I think too, it's like it can also be good for your career. You know, like as an artist, like as someone who really, right, as like who am I? I've only really like been deciding I'm going to like make art and share it with people for over a year, right? But like because I decided to create art in this way through the Floral Heart Project that was for other people, it's really um that has sort of like helped my career, right? Because it's been something that the media wants to talk about, is introduced me to a ton of people. It has sort of um like widely broadened the places and the things that I have been engaged in. And so I think to that sort of starving artist commentary is like, I think that that is silly. I think like we all need to make money so that we can live and do things that are valuable for other people. But I also think it's like, okay, well, how do you do that? Right. And maybe one of the ways that more artists could think about doing that is like, how do you make art that is aligned with a social cause or is aligned with a moment or is aligned with a conversation, and then really be part of that, right? Like I care deeply about COVID loss. I also know that the best way for me to engage with that community is through this, like doing something that's really authentic to me. But because of that, I was like included in the Washington Post. I was included in New York Magazine. The New York Post just did a big feature on the Floral Heart Project, right? So then going and submitting pieces for other things or going to galleries or trying to, do whatever those next steps are in the creation of your career are so much benefited from being able to say, oh, I worked on this year-long art project to help the COVID community, but I was able to gain all of this awareness and make these corporate partnerships and grow, because I think that helps people also understand sort of your long-term ability to market and grow your own art practice, and that makes people sort of want to bet on you. And because I think some people buy art because they love it, and some people buy art because they're hoping that
It
it
will
makes
work.
them a lot
Yeah.
of money. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. There, I mean, like I said, like there's an audience for everything, but yeah, there are really genuine people who want to support the artist, and
Yeah.
they're really passionate about work and believing in their work.
And that sometimes those people aren't people, but they're companies. Like 1-800-Flowers took a big chance on me, right? And they
Yeah.
have done a huge amount to support this. Um, Probably way more than I could have found like a private individual who was like, here's a bunch of money. I was able to find a company who like believed in doing this work and had the money to support it. And I think that that's a path that we often forget can be helpful.
Yeah.
And like we have a great relationship. Like it was and I think that is a model that you don't often hear talked about, which is that you could have corporate investment in the same way that people used to have like sponsors, like like royalty used to have artists that they like sponsored to do stuff. And
Yeah.
the same thing can
Patrons.
happen. Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
patrons.
Patron. That's the
Yeah,
better word, yes.
yeah. I mean, that was the norm in the back in the days. But yeah, as we went through the time period, that kind of diminished, and the corporate sponsorship was also in the height in the 50s, even government sponsorship, with the
Yeah.
WPA movement, like being supportive artists. But that all kind of diminished as the time went on. I think you brought a very good point in like corporate partnerships. Like, there's nothing wrong with like partnering with corporate as long as your values and mission is aligned,
Yeah.
are aligned. I don't think that's that's like such a bad thing at all. And not only that, I think you have an amazing skill, not just like a lot of artists don't have, is that, I mean, I know you come from like the marketing, you have like definitely have a on your background, you're even teaching about like marketing universities and even technology executive, but it's a lot of like you were able to achieve something that would take at least 10 or 20 years for an artist would do achieve that success. It only took you what, year and a half to like gain all these you know press, like just through your project, because that's creating more but you
But what a good model for other people. Like, and I think that's sort of what I'm arguing for, is this idea of like, think about your art as like how do you join a movement of other people or join a conversation with other people, provide value, create something that has, sort of a proven value, and then sell that to a corporate part. Like, look for a partner. Like, you don't just have to sell it. Like, look for someone who like believes in you and believes in that thing that you're doing, and that's going to make that grow, and then sort of scale from there, right? And like that's a different business model. And I think there's a lot of people who are like, oh, well, you sold out or you have a corporate partner. And I think that thinking about art, that purity to art, I just think is a limiting belief, and that like I don't feel compromised from working with 1-800-Flowers. I don't feel anything other than extreme amount of support. And that has allowed me to take on bigger and more interesting things, which has allowed me to grow. And like, will I be partnered with them for the rest of my life? I don't think so. But
you
they're
never
really
know.
interesting. And now that I know how to do that, I can take other ideas and go look for other corporate sponsors or other wealthy individuals and sort of rinse and repeat that business model, which ultimately that's what that is, right? It's a business model. And I think it can be really fruitful as long as you're very clear about why you're doing it and what you hope to achieve and what you want that partner to do, and you have a contract and you sort of go from there. It can work out really well.
Absolutely. I think those are the skill set that artists need to gain. It's not, the artist is always just like, oh, I just make art. I don't do anything else. But it's you need to not like, okay, have a clear vision of what you want, why you want to do it. But at the same time, you need to be accountable and be responsible for who you are working with too, because like sometimes the partnership, it could be one-sided. It depends on how you're approaching it and how you are working with these corporate or individuals. It's up to them, and they need to also gain a skill just how to, present themselves to the world. And sometimes like artists are just like dismissive. Oh, I don't want to like be have that kind of
Yeah.
association. But
But the
yeah,
truth is no one can do that, right? Like, no, and in any other sort of professional field, you're never just a whatever, right? Like, in order to become successful, we're all constantly thinking about growing our careers or learning new skills or taking on different types of work in order to get new opportunities. And I think the same thing is true. The same thing is true for art. I also think there's like a lot of artists who don't have a lot of skill who get very, very far because they do sort of figure out the other part of the art industry. And that's like the saddest, but also,
yeah,
but like, there's so many books about how to learn all of that other stuff. And I think there's very little that actually can like help you create really meaningful art. Like, that is on the artist. And the rest of it is all stuff we can learn.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are not like we're born with. It's just that we skills that we need to gain in order to support our vision and mission, right? And that's something that artists, yeah, it's definitely a limiting belief that because we've been taught it's not these things that are not taught in the art schools. Like the notion of like, yeah, art is like making art is a business, and a
You're
lot
just
of
making a
artists,
product.
yeah, it's a product, right?
It's a
But
beautiful, elevated sort of product, but at the end of the day, it's like a t-shirt company, like
yeah, yeah, and like a lot of people don't want to. It's somehow they don't want to sort of associate themselves with it because it's such a like business is such a dirty word. I think that's how people are sort of ingrained in the art, like in the arts community. And I think that's something that we need to overcome and learn to overcome that. And also business is like a form of creativity, right? Like you need to sort of be
totally.
really creative in order to achieve the goals and create an impact. So I don't think it's a separate entity. It definitely goes in hand in it. As long as you do the work, anyone could have the ideas, right? Like have a brilliant ideas. If it's nothing is done to them, the idea is nothing. So it's just as long as people do their work and constantly pushing, right? Like repetition, practice, and that they'll achieve their goals. And I think that's like one key thing that people have this understanding.
Yeah, I think that's so true. The only thing I would add to that is my boyfriend has this phrase, it's just a nut to crack. And I think that's true of any profession, right? Like you are just trying to figure out like how to crack the nut. And then once you crack it, then you can sort of like, I don't know. I mean, I used to work in space technology, right? And that was just a matter of being like, that was like a nut I had to crack. I didn't know anything about space. So I just sort of like tried to figure it out. But when you think about it that way, like it's a puzzle. How do you just crack it? Um,
Absolutely. Oh, hello. Ooh.
so
All
I
right.
switched locations. No, but so I mean, I think the thing about everything is just a nut to crack. And if you start to think about the puzzle of that, right? Like if you start to think about everything as just this puzzle that you're trying to solve, it kind of removes all guilt. It removes all senses of insecurity. It removes all sense of failure because then, like, nothing is a failure. It just means you haven't cracked the nut yet, right? And you might get tired. You might be like, I don't want to do this anymore. But it's just that. It's just like you just have to sort of figure it out. And I think for me, I mean, in regards to art, one of the things I think I realized was I didn't want to wait 10 to 20 years to be able to talk about the things I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about them now because I felt like they were really important. And so I had to find a different way of doing that. And for me, it meant this new medium, it meant public art, and then it meant finding a corporate partner who wanted to do this with me, who believed in this mission. And that's a nut to crack, right? You're sort of like, okay, well, who in America would be interested in this message? Like who is interested in this medium? Who wants to help me? And then I very lucky happened to be in a meeting with someone who was incredibly senior at 1-800-Flowers. And it was just like a really natural way to get connected into that. But I would have totally missed that opportunity if I hadn't have been thinking, how do I speed this up a little bit? Um, how do I make sure that I don't spend 20 years as a starving artist? Because I don't want to do that because
Right. But
I like having enough money to be able to make the things I want to make. And so that's the problem I had to solve was like, how can I afford to make art?
yeah,
And this was my answer.
yeah, and it's definitely it's problem solving that a lot of people don't think about with art. Running an art business, it's also not just creativity, but also it's about how to get there. Problem solving, right? Like how do I get to from A to B, point A to B, and what would it take to
Yeah.
get there. So it's in that sense, yeah, it's another mindset
Yeah.
that artists definitely need to adopt.
Yeah.
The last question, I think, as you know, the time is almost running up, but yeah. So as you know, how do you define success as an artist?
I want to be paid well for the time I spend making what I am making, but that is a part to me, that is like a part of it. And then I think the other part is that I want to make things that force people to reconsider their own ideas. Like I want that is really being successful, is if I have done something that changes how you think about something else.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, for the COVID loss community, these floral hearts make people who've lost someone go from no one cares about the loss of my loved ones to someone cares about the loss of my loved ones. And like that feels like success. And if I can do that while still being able to live in my apartment and eat the food I want to eat and be able to, do the things I want to do, and for the people in my family, then I have done a good job, I think.
Absolutely. I think that really describes well. It's just like creating impact
Yeah.
through your vision, I think, and you know, helping people, right, and heal. I think that's definitely a success. And so, where can we see these pieces? Where are you planning your next installation, and where can we see the digital the
Yeah.
piece that you mentioned earlier?
The digital piece is on display in Tribeca at 98 Franklin Street as
Mm-hmm.
part of a gallery exhibit called Spread Light. And that piece is actually done in partnership with Mind Alt, which is like a deodorant company they're actually wonderful uh, aromatherapy deodorants. And they very graciously, talking about another corporate sponsor, they very graciously paid for me to be included in this space. So they sort of covered all of the costs of inclusion in the project. And so that was really wonderful. The next piece, we'll do a number of pieces on January 19th. Now I sort of have a group of volunteers around the country who are helping to make floral hearts in other locations. And then the really next big installation will be on March 1st, which is the National Day of Mourning for COVID. There will be a floral heart in every state in America. So on
Amazing.
this one day, we'll sort of have this beautiful visual memorial across America. And I think that to me will be such a nice way to sort of um, really take this from a single heart that I laid in Brooklyn Bridge to something that kind of covers America.
Yeah, I mean, I had like as you were talking to all these things, I was like getting my eyes were getting teary. But I mean, can't wait to see like more of these throughout throughout the country, even and throughout New York City, of course. That's the starting point. But I want to I so appreciate your sharing your journey, your stories, and the impact that you have been creating, and throughout the more as throughout the year. So really looking forward to seeing your work, and I really appreciate your generosity and your insight. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
All right.
Bye.